More than 6 out of 10 people who called could not reach a live assister. That's simply unacceptable, especially when you consider that our goal for the phone level of service in a given year is 80%.
That's the current IRS Commissioner, John Koskinen, discussing what he terms as the negative impact of budget cuts on his agency. Back now on America's Forum with Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth. And Miranda, we spoke of it earlier. Today is the last day to file taxes, but for many taxpayers, there could be a rude awakening, especially if they try to contact the IRS.
Yeah, no kidding. This year, taxpayers across the country were lining up for hours outside walk-in centers, and only 4 in 10 calls for information were actually answered by the IRS. So clearly our tax dollars aren't going to help them.
Well, they just want more of them.
Is that what it is?
We need to talk to a guy who used to run that agency. For more on the story, we welcome in presidential candidate Mark Everson, the former chief revenuer. He was the IRS commissioner back when I served on the Ways and Means Committee. Mark, it's great to have you again from Newsmax, New York. We thank you for your time. What about what Koskinen is claiming? Are budget cuts really the reason behind seeming chaos now at the IRS?
Well, the budget certainly has a very big impact, J.D., but there are a couple of other things. First, Congress itself is a mess. They never act on the tax legislation until the last minute. That makes it hard for the service. Identity theft is rampant. And then there's all the work that the service has had to do with the Affordable Care Act. All of that converges to make a lot of work. And then, yes, Congress, because of the political targeting mess, has been, by its own admission, rather punitive on the IRS budget. So that's a bad cocktail, J.D. Turning to the campaign, that's one reason I argue for bold tax reform, where we really simplify the code and take 150 million people off the rolls. We've got to do something, because right now it's very dysfunctional, and it's ultimately, I don't think it's happened yet, but my real worry is that compliance will go down and people will stop paying honestly and accurately if we're not careful.
Mark, let's talk about something else that the commissioner also brought up, and that is the lack of resources, that there are actually fewer people working. And according to him, this is what he said, IRS staffing is at 87,000, a level not seen since the early 1980s. That, I believe, could be an issue, right?
That's tied to the budget. It's also tied to the demographics. So the code's very complex. It takes a long time to train people. And so you've got to have a pipeline of talent that's working its way through. And that's not really the case right now because of hiring freezes. It's true, the service gets more efficient, Miranda, because of electronic filing, but there's still a lot of work to do, if you will. And what I'm suggesting again is that you simplify things. You can take 150 million people off the tax rolls altogether, put in a consumption tax, leave the income tax in for the high end, and it's a revenue neutral proposal, but that would really enable a lot of those calls, if you will, would go away to the IRS because people wouldn't be having to file a tax return.
You know, it's interesting, Mark, as you lay that out, and we touched on it before, your notion of tax reform, a consumption tax for those earning at the lower levels, but an income tax for those who are prosperous. Doesn't that set up the danger that tax returns, that whole thing, we can basically end up again with the system we have now? About a minute 30 to discuss this, sir.
I don't think that'll happen, J.D. I think people will see it's a good trade-off to take anybody earning $100,000. That'd be a couple earning $100,000. They just wouldn't have to file a return at all. And I think that Congress would be very reluctant to start to change that approach once you went through the big change. And certainly, if I were president, I wouldn't be going back to the old system. But again, the nice thing about what I'm proposing is it also brings down the rates for the high end, and it would let you bring down the business rates too, so that the American business could be competitive overseas. Everybody's worried about our ability to compete with Europe and Asia. So the proposal I speak to would do a lot in that regard.
Well, the whole deal is too, Mark, in 30 seconds to answer, it would not do away with the IRS, but change the agency somewhat. Can you tell us how?
Oh, well, think of all the calls that are coming in from people who are confused about things. The agency would be a lot smaller. It would be focusing on businesses, international businesses. It would be focusing in on are the taxes being withheld properly by the states for payroll taxes. There are a lot of things the IRS would keep doing, but the agency itself would go way down. Tens of thousands of employees could
Well,
be
that's
shed.
a
It'd just
timely
be a lot
message.
easier.
A timely message on this tax day. Speaking of time, we've run out of it now, but we're bringing you back, Mark, after the break. Stay tuned. More with presidential candidate Mark Everson coming up.
When was the last time you really felt the country was on the right track? It's probably been a while. Our politicians are not being straight with us. Each party offers painless solutions that protect special interests and reward millionaire lobbyists. At a time when America is going to choose our next president, let's begin a serious discussion about how best to proceed as a nation.
Alongside Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth back with you on America's Forum. We just saw a glimpse of the message being offered by the gentleman who is our former chief revenuer, who now wants to be our next chief executive. That would be presidential candidate Mark Everson. Let's continue our conversation with him as he is with us from Newsmax, New York. So we just saw a little bit of your campaign ad. Tell us what makes you different and why you should be the pick of Republicans in 2016 for president.
Two things, JD. One, I'm talking about real issues that we've got to get back to for the health of the country. I'm talking about the tax reform. We've already covered that. Taking a good look at the big banks, which have been operating in a way that's really pretty lawless. Real consideration is the death of the community banks. We're just not getting the business creation. We've got to look at our banking system. Republicans should be concerned about the health of our banking system as much as our national security or limited forms of government. I talk about national security. Obviously, it's a big deal with the Iranian conversation right now. I say we should bring back the draft so that even the rich and powerful, all of us, share in the protection of our nation. I talk about entitlement reform so that we can get the spending under control and we have a future. And as you know, the last time I was on, we talked about immigration. I think if we don't reinforce our tradition of assimilation, we're going to have real problems down the road, just like Europe is having now. And lastly, I talk about constitutional governance. And this gets to the point of my qualifications. We're having a big debate right now. Look at the to and fro on Iran and the powers of the Congress. I recognize that the powers of the presidency, while significant, are limited. And I have a track record. I've been in 6 years under Reagan, 6 years under the second President Bush, run the IRS, number 2 at the INS. So people can look at me and they can see executive experience in the federal government. Usually, most organizations, they choose a leader who knows the business. I know the business better than anybody else who's on the Republican side, who's seeking the office.
So, Mark, you actually worked with President Reagan when it came to amnesty. You mentioned assimilation. How would you describe President Obama's performance when it comes to dealing with immigration?
Yeah. This goes right to the question, Miranda, of constitutional governance. I think the president has used all his authority and then some, whether it's in the ACA with, just waiving deadlines, or this really unprecedented enforcement deferral for 4 or 5 million people who are here illegally, the granting of work authorization, even now saying you can go back and file for EITC that you didn't claim. This really is rather breathtaking. So I think we need full immigration reform, change the legal system, strengthen the border, get that electronic verification so that people can't get a job if they're not entitled to. But I also believe in the amnesty, the path to citizenship, so that we, and get everybody to learn English, so that we reassert again that tradition of assimilation.
All right, but here's the thing, and it's important. We've got a minute left, Mark. I want to drill down on this. You are for amnesty. You say it will be coupled with assimilation. How will that happen when heretofore it hasn't? 45 seconds.
Well, the reason it hadn't happened before, JD, is because the employer sanctions didn't work. But if you do the E-Verify, and any employer has to check to make sure the potential employee is here legally and authorized to work, then that'll close down that magnet. So what you've got to do is deal with the problem as of today, going forward, and then take care of these 11, 12 million people who are here. And I want them all in. I don't want the criminals in, but but I want to take care of those who are being productive and bring them into America.
Well, Mark Everson, we will give you a place to put forth your ideas. We thank you for offering those ideas to us, and we look forward to our next visit with you on the campaign trail. May not agree with everything, but always good to talk with Mark. We talk taxes. Now we're going to talk spending. Terry Jeffrey is keeping his eye on that, and we'll have him on next.